In 2018, a young bank employee named Bruno Drummond was in a car accident. The impact crushed part of his spinal cord, and doctors delivered the verdict that so many people dread most: complete tetraplegia. He would not move his arms and wouldn't walk. He would spend the rest of his life entirely dependent on others for the most basic tasks. Bruno was told, as millions of patients before him had been told, that the spinal cord cannot repair itself, that modern medicine had no answer yet, and that this was permanent. That was wrong. Within months of receiving a single experimental injection delivered within 24 hours of his accident, Bruno Drummond de Freitas was walking again, playing sports, living a normal life, and no longer in treatment. A protein called polylaminin made this possible, and the woman who spent 30 years of her life creating it is a Brazilian scientist named Dr. Tatiana Coelho de Sampaio. Working out of a public university in Rio de Janeiro with limited funding, mounting obstacles, and an absolute refusal to give up. This is her story, and it's still being written. Dr. Tatiana Coelho Sampaio is a biologist and professor at UFRJ, the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. She coordinates the Laboratory of Extracellular Matrix Biology at the Institute of Biomedical Sciences. Her academic background is in cellular and molecular biology, with postdoctoral research completed in both the United States and Germany. Her obsession, from early in her career, was a question that most scientists had already given up on. What if the spinal cord could be coaxed into repairing itself? She began her research on laminin proteins in 1995. By 1999, when most of us were watching The Matrix in theaters, Tatiana was in a lab studying this protein, a molecule naturally present in the human body that plays a crucial role in how neurons grow and communicate during embryonic development. She noticed something remarkable. Laminin is extraordinarily abundant in the early human body, particularly in the placenta, precisely when the nervous system is being built. It essentially forms a biological scaffold that guides neurons toward each other, helping them form the connections that allow us to think, feel, and move. As we age, laminin becomes rarer. But what if, in the event of a traumatic spinal cord injury, you could bring it back? That question became 30 years of her life, and the answer may be yes. But the road there was anything but simple. She faced budget cuts. Brazil's National Patent Office took 18 years to process her patent registration. During the austerity years of 2015 and 2016, federal university funding was slashed severely. Tatiana paid out of her own pocket to prevent losing her patent in Brazil. And then, despite her efforts, Brazil lost those international patent rights anyway. A discovery made with Brazilian public money may ultimately be commercialized abroad. She has been vocal about this injustice. She remained in the lab and kept going. So, what exactly is polylaminin and how does it work? First, a quick biology refresher. To move your big toe, just your big toe, your brain sends a signal through a chain of neurons. One neuron in your brain fires a signal to a second neuron called lower motor neuron inside your spinal cord, which then carries it all the way down to your foot. A spinal cord injury breaks that chain. It's not that the neurons die entirely, it's that the communication pathway between them is severed. The electrical impulse simply can't get through. For decades, medicine said that pathway cannot be restored. Once cut, it stays cut. What Dr. Sampaio discovered is that this assumption may not always be true. She developed polylaminin, a polymerized, lab-stabilized form of the laminin protein, extracted from human placentas. Think of it as an enhanced, concentrated version of the same molecular glue that originally built your nervous system. It makes a mosaic of crosses, and many call it the God's protein. When injected directly into the site of a spinal cord injury, polylaminin appears to do something extraordinary. It creates a biological environment that encourages the longest part of neurons, called axons, to grow new extensions, navigate around the damaged tissue, and reconnect with the next neuron in the chain. In Dr. Sampaio's own words, this is not about repairing nerves mechanically. It's about recreating the biological conditions that allow neurons to reconnect. Researchers describe it as a kind of biological glue, not forcing the repair, but creating the conditions for the nervous system to heal itself. And critically, the treatment requires only a single injection delivered as close to the time of injury as possible. Let's go a layer deeper into the science, because this part is important for understanding both the promise and the limitations. The scientific basis for polylaminin goes back further than the human trials. Early rodent studies published in peer-reviewed journals showed that polylaminin, unlike non-polymerized laminin, significantly improved motor function after thoracic spinal cord compression, and even complete transection in rats. Crucially, neurons were shown to actually regrow across the injury site. Labeled neurons were detected on the far side of complete cuts, meaning fibers were genuinely bridging the gap. In August 2025, new research from UFRJ was published in Frontiers in Veterinary Science. 6 dogs with chronic spinal cord injuries, animals who had been paralyzed for months, had undergone surgery and physiotherapy and shown no improvement, received polylaminin combined with either GDNF or chondroitinase ABC, 2 molecules that support neural growth. No serious adverse events occurred, no neurological deterioration, no concerning changes in blood work, and some of the dogs began to move again. This is significant for 2 reasons. First, it confirms safety in a larger mammalian model. Second, it suggests polylaminin may work in chronic injuries, not just acute cases, opening a potential door for patients who were injured years ago. The spinal cord's extracellular matrix, the complex network of proteins surrounding spinal neurons, normally forms a barrier to regeneration after injury. Scar tissue accumulates and inhibitory molecules proliferate. The environment actively discourages neural regrowth. Laminin, however, is one of the few molecules known to promote axonal growth. It essentially tells axons, "Keep going, you can get through here," by polymerizing laminin into a stabilized mesh structure. Dr. Sampaio's team was able to create a more durable, injectable form of this signal. When placed at the injury site, it appears to override some of the inhibitory signals and give axons a new biological pathway to grow through. The first human academic trial followed. 8 patients with complete spinal cord injuries received a single intraspinal injection of polylaminin, on average 2.3 days after their accident. 2 passed away from causes unrelated to the treatment, complications from the severity of their initial injuries. The Brazilian National Ethics Commission reviewed the cases and concluded the deaths were not related to the treatment. Of the 6 who survived to the 1-month follow-up, all 6 showed signs of motor recovery according to international neurological classification standards, 6 out of 6, against a 15% baseline. Numbers matter, but people matter more. Let's talk about the real human beings behind this research. Bruno Drummond de Freitas, whom you met at the start of this video, received polylaminin within 24 hours of his 2018 car accident. Within months, he had achieved what his doctors described as a complete recovery. He was playing sports, living without any ongoing treatment, and running an Instagram page at Lesionado to share his experience and offer hope to others living with spinal cord injuries. He described moving his toe for the first time as a moment of disbelief, a tiny movement that represented the beginning of getting his entire life back. Luis Fernando Moser was the very first patient ever treated, a 37-year-old who became tetraplegic after a motocross accident. Within 48 hours of his injection, he reported the return of sensation and voluntary muscle contractions in his thighs. Silvania can now lift her legs and pedal a stationary bike. Guilherme regained mobility in his arms, hands, and abdomen. Nilma Palmeira de Mello, an artisan, regained control of her torso, can operate her own wheelchair independently, and performs feats of strength she could not previously imagine. A 35-year-old man who suffered a motorcycle accident regained movement in his foot and sensation in his legs. A 24-year-old injured in a waterfall accident also showed recovery. Diogo Barros Brolo, 35, was another case where partial recovery was documented. These are not anecdotes. These are documented cases, reviewed by the Ethics Commission. It's worth being clear. Not every patient had the same outcome. Some showed partial recovery. Others showed more complete restoration. The research team is careful to note that the treatment window appears to matter significantly. The closer to the injury, the better the results seem to be. Beyond the original 8, the story grew. Desperate patients and their families began going to Brazilian courts, filing injunctions to access the experimental drug before Phase 1 trials were formally authorized. As of early 2026, Cristália Pharmaceuticals had received 37 such judicial requests. 22 of them resulted in the actual administration of polylaminin. Among those court-ordered cases, 3 patients have died. On January 28th, February 1st, and February 9th of 2026. Cristália states that all 3 presented with severe pre-existing clinical conditions, and that there is currently no evidence establishing a causal relationship between polylaminin and the deaths. An analysis is ongoing. The company monitors all compassionate use cases. Through follow-up contact with physicians and families, Dr. Sampaio herself has warned about the risks of this approach. We cannot monitor the people, provide the best support, or collect the data that Anvisa needs. We are using an experimental drug without the protection of a clinical study. She is right, and that tension between desperate patients who cannot wait and the rigorous process that must happen before we truly know is the defining challenge of this moment. Let's get specific about where things stand right now. As of March 2026, on January 5th, 2026, Anvisa, Brazil's equivalent of the FDA, officially authorized the start of Phase 1 clinical trials for polylaminin. This came after nearly 3 years of regulatory analysis, requests for additional safety data, and documentation review. Submitted by Cristália Pharmaceuticals, it was the agency's first authorization after the request was submitted at the end of 2022. The Phase 1 trial is small and tightly defined. 5 volunteers aged 18 to 72 who have suffered a complete injury to the thoracic spinal cord between vertebrae T2 and T10, requiring surgery within 72 hours of the trauma. Chronic injuries are excluded from this phase. The primary goal is safety, identifying risks and side effects. If Phase 1 results are satisfactory, Phase 2 will evaluate efficacy. Phase 3 will confirm results at scale. Only after all 3 phases can polylaminin be submitted for full marketing approval. Anvisa's new president, Leandro Safatle, who took office in September 2025, had explicitly named polylaminin as one of the agency's priorities for 2026. That signal from the top carries significance. Meanwhile, the treatment is already spreading, not through trials, but through courts and political will. The state of Paraná, led by Governor Carlos Ratinho Jr., has made the entire state health network available to coordinate polylaminin transport and application. As of early March 2026, 30 applications of polylaminin had been performed across Brazil. 8 of those were in Paraná alone, with the state government actively supporting the infrastructure needed to get the drug to eligible patients within the 72-hour window. There is one sobering logistical reality in all of this. As of now, only 4 doctors in all of Brazil are trained to perform the intraspinal injection. The procedure is conducted in a surgical center, under sedation and local anesthesia, directly into the spinal cord injury site. It is precise, technically demanding, and requires expertise that simply doesn't exist yet at scale. The CEO of Lamalamb, a company involved in operationalizing the treatment, has described the process as requiring extreme coordination. As soon as the patient is admitted, the physician must assess eligibility, register the case with Anvisa, and the medication must arrive within 72 hours. Building that system nationally is a massive undertaking. There is also a significant shadow over this story that deserves to be acknowledged. Brazil lost international patent rights to polylaminin. The 18-year delay at INPI, Brazil's patent office, combined with budget cuts that prevented UFRJ from paying international patent maintenance fees, meant that the protections lapsed in several jurisdictions. This has raised serious concerns that the discovery made with Brazilian public funding could ultimately be commercialized by international pharmaceutical companies without benefit flowing back to Brazil or the public institutions that produced it. Dr. Sampaio has been vocal about this. She has drawn comparisons to scientific funding in the United States, noting that much of American pharmaceutical research also relies heavily on public investment, and arguing that cutting university budgets is ultimately a form of transferring publicly generated knowledge to private hands abroad. Let's talk honestly about scale. Who could benefit from polylaminin if it reaches full clinical approval? Globally, between 250,000 and 500,000 people suffer a new spinal cord injury each year. Brazil alone carries hundreds of thousands of people living with permanent paralysis, from traffic accidents, falls, sports injuries, and violence as the leading causes. If future clinical trials confirm the therapy's effectiveness, it could potentially help a wide range of patients. Tetraplegia, paraplegia, severe spinal cord trauma victims, stroke-related nerve damage, and neurodegenerative nerve injuries. Worldwide, an estimated 15 to 27 million people live with spinal cord injuries. In the human pilot study, 6 out of 6 surviving patients with complete injuries. who received polylaminin within 72 hours showed motor recovery. The spontaneous recovery rate for complete injuries is under 15%. That gap is statistically extraordinary. But the sample size of 6 is far too small to extrapolate globally. We need hundreds of patients in randomized controlled trials for acute injuries administered within 72 hours. The treatment window is the most important variable. Every hour matters. In systems where trauma patients can be quickly assessed and treated, the opportunity is real. For chronic injuries, the picture is more cautious, but not hopeless. The August 2025 canine study showed functional improvements in chronically paralyzed dogs, suggesting the treatment may not be limited to acute cases. Human data for chronic injuries remains emerging, and there's a critically important equity dimension here. Dr. Sampaio and others have expressed the hope that polylaminin will eventually be incorporated into Brazil's SUS, the unified health system, making it available at no cost to any Brazilian patient. If that happens, this will be one of the most significant examples in modern medicine of publicly funded research returning directly to the public. If it doesn't, if the lost international patents allow foreign pharmaceutical companies to control global pricing, then the people who most need it may be the last to get it. As extraordinary as this story is, it would be irresponsible not to acknowledge what remains unresolved. Phase 1. Trials have only just begun, with 5 volunteers. We do not yet have the large-scale safety and efficacy data. That will determine whether this treatment works consistently across different injury types, ages, and severity levels. The regulatory pathway, while progressing, will take years. Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3. Trials done rigorously cannot and should not be rushed. Patient safety requires this rigor. That data will take years to collect. The treatment window is a major infrastructure challenge. 72 hours sounds like a long time, until you consider the reality of trauma care in Brazil, or in any country where hospital access and surgical capacity are unevenly distributed. Only 4 doctors are currently qualified to administer the injection in a country of 215 million people. The compassionate use controversy is real and unresolved. 3 deaths in early 2026 are under investigation, while no causal link to polylaminin has been established. The use of an experimental drug outside clinical trial protocols, without the monitoring and data collection that would establish clear causality, means we may not get the answers we need from these cases. Dr. Sampaio is right to be concerned about this. Chronic injuries remain a partially answered question. The animal results are encouraging, but human data for older injuries is still emerging. The patent situation is a wound that will take time to assess. Brazil losing international patent rights means the global commercial future of polylaminin is uncertain, and the risk of exploitation by large pharmaceutical companies is real, without benefit flowing back to Brazilian institutions or patients. None of this erases what has been achieved. It just means the work isn't over. Dr. Tatiana Coelho de Sampaio started this work before the internet was a household word. She worked through funding crises, bureaucratic obstacles, and institutional inertia. That treats impossible as a permanent verdict rather than a temporary challenge. On January 5, 2026, Anvisa signed the authorization. After nearly 3 years of regulatory review and 25 years of scientific work, polylaminin entered official clinical trials. That same week, patients in Paraná were receiving injections through court orders. Families were staying up through the night to make sure the medication arrived in time. 4 doctors were being prepared to perform a procedure that didn't exist a decade ago. And somewhere in Rio de Janeiro, in a laboratory that wasn't given enough resources, wasn't given international patent protection, wasn't given the full recognition it deserved, Dr. Tatiana Coelho de Sampaio was still working. Bruno Drummond moved his toe. Silvania pedaled her legs. Guilherme lifted his arms. Nilma operates her wheelchair with her own hands. These are not miracles. They are the result of one scientist's refusal to accept impossible as a final answer. The story isn't over, but it has already changed lives, and it may change millions more. Subscribe, like, and comment.